Welcome to Friendly Math 101. Today's lesson is over ASA and AAS. So we'll talk about what those mean. These are two ways of determining whether or not two triangles are congruent. The first thing we can look at, ASA, means angle, side, angle. Which means if you have two triangles and they have an angle, a side, and an angle in that order congruent, then they are congruent. So if we have these angles equal, the included side equal, and then the other angle equal. The point of this one is the side has to be in between the two angles for it to be ASA. So it has to be a side included between the two angles that you're given. So this would be congruent. Okay, so AAS would mean angle, angle, side. So if we have our two triangles, we're going to have two angles that are congruent and a side, but the side is now excluded from between them. So it's not in between the two angles, it's going to be one of the sides not included. So angle, angle, side, angle, angle, side. That would make these congruent. So if you have any two angles in a side, your triangles will be congruent. However, if the side is in between the two angles, it's ASA. If the side is not in between the two angles, it's AAS. So in our examples, we are going to determine if we can tell that the two triangles are congruent. If they are, we will state how we know. So it's either going to be ASA or AAS. So when we're using these two, they both have to have two congruent angles. So if we don't have two congruent angles, then we can't determine whether or not they're congruent. So here we can already see we have these angles congruent and these angles congruent. So we have that these are congruent. So I can say yes, congruent, because we have two angles and a side. Now I need to determine, is it a side in between the two angles or not in between the two angles? That will tell me if it's ASA or AAS. So my side is actually not in between. Here are my two angles. Side in between would be this side, CD and AC. It's not in between, it's on the outside of those two angles. So this one would be AAS. The S is not in between. Now let's write our congruency statement. So I'm going to label it triangle ABC is congruent to triangle. Well, A is congruent to D, so that's going to be a D there. Angle C is congruent to angle C, so that C has to be on the end there, which means this E has to be in the middle. Okay, next example. Remember, when we're looking at just ASA and AAS, we need two angles congruent. We don't have, or we're not given that two angles are congruent here, so we cannot say by these two that they're congruent. So not congruent, we just can't determine it. They could be, but we can't really determine. Even though we have an angle, and actually this side's congruent to itself. So even though we have an angle and two sides, we cannot say it's congruent by ASA or AAS. So I'm just going to say not congruent. Okay, next example. Now remember, I need two angles to be congruent for me to say that these two are congruent. I do have two angles and a side, so yes. As long as you have two angles and a side, they will always be congruent. You just have to determine, is the side inside the two angles or outside? This side is not in between the two angles, so it's going to be AAS. Okay, and now let's label out our triangles, our congruency statement. So I'm just going to label this first one ABC. Angle A is congruent to D, so D is going to go there. C is congruent to F, so where C is, F will be, which makes E in the middle. Okay, so triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF by angle, side. Thank you for watching, and for more math tutorials, please subscribe to our channel, Friendly Math 101.